Hello, and welcome to this special CGAI webinar to discuss what the new NATO strategic concept should look like. I'm your host, Colin Robertson. The strategic concept is important because it defines the purpose and strategy going forward for the 30-member transatlantic collective alliance that includes Canada. Canada was instrumental in the creation of NATO in 1949, and as Lester Pearson, who played a key role in NATO's creation, would later write in his memoirs, NATO represents, quote, our firm commitment to collective action against an aggressor was the main factor in removing the greatest temptation to aggression, the hope and expectation of easy victory. The strategic concept is top of the agenda at this June's NATO summit in Madrid, and to talk about what should be in it, I'm joined by CGAI Fellow and Alphen Group Chair, Dr. Julian Lindley-French, former NATO Deputy Secretary General Sandy Vershbow, who also previously served as US Ambassador to South Korea, Russia, and NATO, former Canadian Ambassador to NATO Kerry Buck, who also served as Political Director, and the Honourable David Collenette, former National Defence Minister and Chair of the NATO Association of Canada. Today's event is organized in partnership with the NATO Association of Canada. Some context. Over the past months, the Alphen Group, an informal network of leading strategic thinkers who includes Julian, Sandy, and myself, come together to consider the future of the transatlantic relationship and European security and defense and do something about it. We prepared a shadow strategic concept paper that we have discussed with the NATO Secretariat and submitted to the Secretary General. The shadow concept was released last week at a webinar hosted out of Brussels by the German Marshall Fund. GMF, CGAI, and the Norwegian Atlantic community sponsored the shadow strategic concept. The document, short and readable, is divided into 6 parts. Enduring purpose of an adaptive alliance, NATO's evolving strategic environment, reinforcing and rebalancing the transatlantic relationship, NATO's core tasks and responsibilities, alliance forces in the 2020s, and finally, Strategic Concept 2022, preserving peace, protecting people. The Shadow Strategic Concept paper is available on the CGAI website with a link to the program, and we'll also link to with it in the program notes that will also contain the full biographies of our distinguished panel. To give you a sense of how we're going to do today, we'll begin with an overview of the Shadow Strategic Concept from Julian and Sandy, and then I'm going to ask Kerry and David to offer their observations on the document and how it should apply to Canadian planning. We'll have a brief discussion and then we'll respond to your questions. I ask that you use the chat function. My colleague David Perry will field them and pose your questions to our panel. So let's get started. Julian, give us a sense of what the Shadow Strategic Concept paper is all about.
Thank you, Colin. A delight to be with you over here in the Netherlands. And let me say at the beginning that this Shadow Strategic Concept could not have been delivered without the support of CGAI and the wonderful team that you lead, and I'm certainly, and I think the whole team, very grateful. Let me first begin by giving you 2 quotes from the Shadow NATO Strategic Concept. Quote 1, Strategic Concept 22 is a politico-strategic vision, not a military strategic concept. But any such vision must be an effective, based on effective military power. Therefore, its primary focus is on identifying the principles, parameters, and guidance necessary for the development of the right policies, strategic operational planning, and force structure and capabilities. This includes improved transatlantic burden sharing and the creation by 2030, of a more balanced alliance in which the European allies produce a sufficiency of capabilities and enablers for them to take more responsibility alongside the United States for collective defense and as credible first responders in the event of crises and emergencies, end quote. The second quote starts thus. Strategic Concept 2022 builds on the NATO 2030 agenda by making the alliance both more effective and more efficient through greater political cohesion, the improved readiness, capability, and capacity of allied armed forces, enhanced resilience, more equitable burden sharing, a reinforced NATO-EU relationship, and strengthened function-driven partnerships. Better NATO preparedness to meet the threats posed by emerging and disruptive technologies, both to the functioning of our open democratic societies and in the battle space, is also central to Strategic Concept 2022. Now, in a nutshell, those two quotes encapsulate the challenge the Alliance faces, and in a sense, also the specific mission of our shadow strategic concept. We wanted to highlight the main issues NATO must address and the tests the forthcoming real strategic concept must pass. To that end, the shadow NATO strategic concept, in a sense, operationalizes NATO 2030. You recall that document delivered to the Secretary General in the middle of last year. In light of the threats the Alliance must engage going forward and the strategic environment with which it must contend if it is to remain credible, keyword that, credible, in its core missions. We also reaffirm the vital role of defending our shared values as the foundation of our legitimate alliance. Legitimacy is central to our alliance. As democracies, it must always be. If there's a core message, it is in effect thus: the Ukrainian crisis puts into stark relief NATO's coming political and military challenge out to 2030 and indeed beyond. At the heart of our shadow concept is a reaffirmation of the Alliance's three core missions of collective defense, crisis management, and cooperative security, but reconceived for a new geopolitical age, demanding of Europeans in particular, but also I was just Canadians, far greater strategic ambition, underpinned by far greater strategic responsibility for our own collective defense, not least because of the pressures that are growing on the United States. There were 10 core issues which I'll very quickly deal with. 1, deterrence, defense, and resilience. 2, adaptation, transformation, and a 360-degree alliance. 3, combating terrorism. What exactly is NATO's role in combating terrorism? Where can it add value most effectively? 4, burden sharing, and Sandy will go into that in some detail, but we see that as central to the changing reality of our alliance. 5, and in a sense as a function of burden sharing, what we call European strategic responsibility. Note, not strategic autonomy, but responsibility. Responsibility and autonomy come as a function of power, relative power, not simply words. 6, closing the deterrence gap. The Ukraine crisis has revealed the existence of a deterrence gap in the east of the alliance that must be plugged by more forces with better capability at a higher state of readiness and able to move and fight together. And much of that force must be European. 7, NATO's world. Now, this is important. We do not call for a global NATO, but a NATO that is firmly embedded in the real world, particularly in America's real world. What happens to America impacts upon the alliance fundamentally, and thus able to assist the US cope with the consequences of China's rise in particular. 8, arms control. We reconfirm the centrality of our Euro-Atlantic security and defense alliance to peace, security, and stability in Europe through reinvigorated arms control. 9, human security. We call on the alliance to play its full role where possible in wider security, including climate change and women, peace, and security, including the idea of an alliance of all the talents. Our people are our comparative advantage, and we must make the most of all our people if we are to maintain that advantage. And 10, the forthcoming strategic concept must be a game changer, which is why the Alphen Group has written the game-changing shadow strategic concept. Ultimately, NATO is a politico-military alliance, the core business of which is deterrence, and its critical asset, legitimate fighting power. Therefore, NATO's future credibility as a defensive alliance will rely on NATO balancing firepower, people power, and tech power to meet the challenge of multi-domain warfare in a digital age. That will be the center of gravity of the forthcoming NATO strategic concept, and why the centerpiece of our concept, our shadow strategic concept, is what we call the Allied Mobile Heavy Force, a force that will sit mainly in Central Europe, that is big enough to support nations dealing with crises, and mobile enough and effective enough to act as the core of a first responder in the event of a major state-on-state crisis of the kind that appears to be emerging to our east today. But that's a development process over some years, but that should be the ambition implicit in our strategic concept. To conclude, Canada. Canada has always made the alliance an alliance rather than simply a US protectorate. I don't think many Canadians realize that your involvement and your centrality to the alliance as a political alliance is fundamental. It's a two-way street. It's not just about the North Americans protecting Europeans. It's about Europeans supporting North Americans, and that'll become much more of a narrative in the coming decade. Canada has always done its bit, but frankly, we need more Canada. First, we need to keep the Arctic an area of exploration, not competition. Second, Canada is central to defending North America. If we can't defend our home bases, we cannot project the stabilizing power that the alliance will need in the coming years. Three, making North American society more resilient. The Canadian-US continuum, if you like, involves broad uses of energy, information, all of which could be subject to hybrid and cyber attacks. Four, helping to ensure the alliance can move forces and resources across the Atlantic in an emergency, an increasingly contested North Atlantic. My grandfather served alongside in the Royal Navy, served alongside the Royal Canadian Navy during World War II, and was always greatly impressed in the vital role that the Royal Canadian Navy played. Five, reinforcing legitimacy through presence. Your presence in Europe reinforces that legitimate right to defend, which is central to the very mission of our democratic alliance. And six, finally, and frankly, good old-fashioned down-to-earth Canadian common sense. We need that at the heart of our alliance, and we need Canada going forward. Thank you, Colin.
Well, thanks very much, Julian. And you echo what President Obama said a few years ago when he visited Canada and spoke at to a joint session of our Parliament and called for NATO needs more Canada, not once, not twice, but 3 times, for which he received a standing ovation. I'm not sure that the parliamentarians realized what that meant in terms of rebalancing, and that's probably a good segue to you, Sandy, because as Julian pointed out, this is something that you know very well, having served both as US ambassador to NATO and then as Deputy Secretary General, the whole rebalancing. I certainly remember, I guess it was Bob Gates' valedictory remarks as Defense Secretary, in which he pleaded with NATO members and said the American public was not going to continue to carry the load. And if I recall, it's still something like 75% American to 25% the rest. So Sandy, why don't you tell us a bit about the rebalancing piece as Julian foreshadowed?
Okay, thank you very much, Colin, and thanks to the Canadian Global Affairs Institute for co-sponsoring our Shadow Strategic Concept project. And it's a pleasure for me to be here today to help with the launch for a Canadian audience. I have the dubious honor of having worked on all 3 previous post-Cold War strategic concepts in 91, 99, and in 2010. So it's been a privilege and a pleasure to have the chance to try to influence the new one, at least vicariously, thanks to Julian Lindley-French's initiative. The 2022 edition, I think, is going to be the most challenging yet, given the unprecedented complexity of the security environment that NATO now faces. Our shadow strategic concept tries to address multiple new threats: systemic rivalry with China, climate change, and emerging disruptive technologies, as well as the increasingly difficult internal challenges to alliance cohesion and decision-making. As Julian said, for NATO to succeed in dealing with all of these formidable challenges, the new strategic concept does need to be a game changer. Now, that said, I think the strategic concept's value will be judged primarily on how well it prepares the alliance to deal with the old threat that is still the most immediate and the most pressing. And that, of course, is an aggressive revanchist Russia that is waging a multidimensional war against the West with the goal of overturning the rules-based order and reversing the changes in Europe following the end of the Cold War, an effort that would take Europe back to the days of spheres of influence. We don't want to go there. Our shadow strategic concept offers, I think, a suitably bleak assessment of Russia's pattern of aggressive coercion and its expanding toolkit of conventional nuclear and hybrid capabilities that confront NATO in multiple theaters and multiple domains, as well as the growing threat to vital undersea and space-based communications. It reaffirms the two-track approach of deterrence and dialogue that NATO adopted after 2014, and it pledges to uphold the NATO-Russia Founding Act, although that's a commitment that may need to be reevaluated between now and the Madrid summit if Russia continues on its current path of violating that agreement and other post-Cold War agreements. Now, our main recommendations on Russia focus on strengthening defense and deterrence and keeping pace with the changing nature of warfare. Especially relevant today is the recommendation to expand NATO's forward presence beyond what was decided in 2016 into a more robust, continuous forward presence from Estonia to Turkey. And NATO may need to start working on this even before the Madrid summit in light of Russia's new normal of provocative behavior along NATO's borders. And there may indeed be calls for Canada not only to stay with its battalion in Latvia, but to expand its contribution to the forward presence that the alliance may need in the face of an even more aggressive Russia. As Julian mentioned, the shadow strategic concept also reaffirms NATO's commitment to arms control and disarmament, and that may be also taking on renewed importance in the short term, at least as a means of de-escalating the current confrontation over Ukraine and managing the strategic competition with Russia over the medium and long term. Now, on Ukraine, where the rules-based order is under the most direct assault, we suggest a more proactive, strategy-driven approach to NATO partnerships, including what we call a Ukraine Deterrence Initiative. That UDI would make it a strategic priority for the alliance to do everything it possibly can, short of an Article 5 guarantee, to help Ukraine and other partners threatened by Russia to defend themselves and deter aggression. This could be an extension of the Enhanced Opportunities Partner Program at a time when Ukrainian membership is clearly not on the NATO agenda. Now, the shadow strategic concept also highlights the growing importance of NATO's partnerships with Finland and Sweden, as well as the need to expand NATO's engagement with democratic nations from the Indo-Pacific region, building on our shared interest in strengthening the rules-based international order against China and Russia. Now, China is also relevant to the second area where our shadow strategic concept calls for a departure from the status quo, and that's on this issue of rebalancing, which I'd like to focus on from here on. As Julian outlined, we argue that the new strategic concept must commit the alliance to a step change in the balance of responsibility between the United States and the European members of the alliance. And I often like to say the European members of the alliance plus Canada. So everybody but the US needs to step up and do more. And this is not just a matter of overcoming the longstanding disputes such as Bob Gates's critique about defense spending. Rather, it's now a strategic necessity because of the rise of China as a strategic competitor and the resultant US need to shift its strategic focus to the Indo-Pacific region. In these circumstances, we argue, NATO can no longer afford its excessive reliance on the US, either for collective defense or for crisis management and cooperative security beyond Europe's borders. In an Article 5 contingency with Russia in the Baltic or Black Sea region, the US may not be able to deploy adequate reinforcements in some cases because of competing demands on its forces in the Indo-Pacific. So the need to reinforce the eastern flank may require that the European allies be able to pick up more of the slack. And similarly, resource constraints and shifting priorities may also lead the United States to limit its involvement in the Middle East, Africa, and South Asia, or at least to be more selective in when and where it engages. And this again means that the US will increasingly look to the other allies, European allies plus Canada, and the European Union to shoulder more of the burden for crisis management and partner capacity building in Europe's immediate neighborhood. So in our view, all these factors argue for a strategic shift toward a more balanced transatlantic partnership in which Europe assumes greater strategic responsibility, backed by full spectrum capabilities and enablers that would make such a rebalancing possible. And that's why we recommend a military level of ambition under which the European allies plus Canada would collectively agree to invest sufficient resources to meet at least 50% of NATO's minimum capability requirements as set by our strategic commanders by the end of this decade. It's a very ambitious level of ambition. And this would, of course, need to include fully usable forces, as well as the strategic enablers required for European allies, together with Canada, to conduct multiple large-scale and smaller-scale operations, whether it's inside the NATO framework or autonomously within the European Union CSDP framework or in a coalition of the willing. Now, ideally, these forces and capabilities should be consolidated into a single pool of European forces supported by the requisite force structure, able to act as a multi-domain, multi-purpose, high-end first responder force, fully interoperable with US forces. And that's what lies behind the idea of an Allied Command Operations Mobile Heavy Force, AMHF, which acronym which rolls off the tongue, I'm sure. So Allies' agreement to this higher European level of ambition would enable NATO to get past ideological debates about the meaning of strategic autonomy and focus on a more equitable division of labor, an enhanced European role in collective defense alongside the United States, and a first responder role in crisis management in and around NATO's periphery, with Canada contributing as much as possible. So let me stop there. I have a few other comments, but I'm sure that other things will come up during our discussion. But again, thanks for this opportunity to present our shadow strategic concept. We hope that it does assist the nations who are working on the real thing to come up with a forward-looking, game-changing strategic concept, even as we contend with the immediate crisis facing us with Russia.
Thanks very much, Sandy. Now I'm going to ask first Kerry Buck and then David Collenette to give a perspective from the Canadian side of things. Kerry, as the audience knows, served as Canada's ambassador to NATO. Prior to that, she was political director, so she's certainly well aware of the international security, both the current environment in which we deal with and the requirements from her experience at NATO. So Kerry, why don't you give us a sense of, you've looked at the shadow paper. I know you've been deeply involved in things international security, collective security, NATO. Please.
Thanks, Colin. And thank you very much for the invitation today. It's wonderful to be in such esteemed company and the company of some good friends. So thank you for that. Julian said that NATO needs more Canada. I'm going to turn parochial for a second and say that Canada needs more NATO. And I want to first take a step back in time to ask why Canada should care about NATO. What's in it for us? As you said, Colin, NATO was embedded in the Canadian consciousness before it was a spark in anyone else's eye. It actually goes back to August 1947, the Couchiching Conference, where it was a Canadian idea put forward in Canada at this conference. It landed with absolutely no notice being taken by the Canadian press, but it resurfaced internationally, leading to the creation of NATO. Why did we bother? Why did we do this? Well, when Pearson was PM, he said, well, in World War II, Canada had accepted British and American dominance because it was necessary. It is unthinkable that this would be the case in the post-war structured constitution. So What are Canadian interests today in NATO? I would argue that NATO continues to serve three Canadian interests. First, at the broad strategic level, NATO continues to preserve peace in the Euro-Atlantic space. Under some pressure right now, but it is in Canada's direct security, economic, and political interests that this remains the case. Second, NATO's helped to build a community of states that can work with Canada on security solutions that are more effective, use a broader range of tools with a broader range of partners, including partners outside NATO. This NATO expansion and NATO partnerships has expanded not only the pool of states that are ready to act when we want to act along with allies in the face of security threats, but also expanded the pool and the number of capable militaries that can not just be interoperable with us, but as I said, deploy with us. NATO also provides a platform for us to push forward, for Canada to push forward on other issues that are of a priority for us. For instance, Canada and Norway lead on women, peace, and security at NATO and across the world. The third way that NATO serves Canadian interests is the international rules-based order. NATO provides a forum where we can call states or other actors to account. So a few examples. Inside NATO, when we have concerns about allied behavior, for instance, concerns about some allies' behavior in Syria, we can use it quietly inside NATO as a platform to dissuade them or to send messages about our concerns about their behavior. Outside NATO, we can use NATO to send unified political messages, and we have consistently in the past. For instance, when the UNSC couldn't act on, let's say, Salisbury poisonings, NATO could speak. We can use the NATO-Russia forum to press Russia on transparency, on troop movements, etc. Or even after January 6th, the NATO SecGen said that the January 6th siege of the US Capitol was an attack on the core values of NATO. So we can use it as a political tool to help push for respect for the international rules-based order. But NATO also serves as a forcing function for respect for rule of law. As states join NATO, they undergo a structured assessment of not only capacity of their military to defend, but also to respect international humanitarian law, have a functioning democratic oversight of the military, civilian and military justice system, etc. So those are the three Canadian interests that NATO continues to serve. So using those three Canadian interests as a framework, I will put on the table a few areas, where Canada should focus its efforts in a strategic concept 2022. First, preserving peace in the Euro-Atlantic space. I would argue that it's in NATO's interest and therefore Canada's interest to bolster not just the eastern flank, but to fill other potential gaps. So when I was in NATO in 2015, that was just as NATO was realigning itself to deal with the Russian invasion of Crimea. And at that time, NATO had had an imbalance. It had built up more on the southern flank because of the Balkans, because of Afghanistan, et cetera. And it made sense that NATO would move to fill in or to rebalance along the eastern flank. So it's very good, I think, that the Prime Minister renewed Canada's contribution to Latvia and enhanced forward presence. I think the next coin that should drop, that will drop, is for NATO to start to enhance deterrence along other parts of that flank, all the way down to the Black Sea, to bolster deterrence. Canada's been in the top tier of contributors to enhanced deterrence since 2014, particularly after the Warsaw announcement about our leadership of the battle group in Latvia. But I would think it is in our interest to continue and to ramp up our contributions as NATO fills that gap. Second area about preserving peace in the Euro-Atlantic space. Well, if bolstering the eastern flank is now, I would say that strategic concept is about how we prepare for the future. So I'm going to turn to Arctic. Some suggest that the Arctic will be open for commercial shipping as early as 20 years from now with climate change. Canada has, I would argue, seriously underinvested in our Arctic and in North American security. I know that there is work underway to increase our investment in NORAD. I would suggest that that would be an important contribution to NATO, to our NATO posture. We need to rethink the Canadian Arctic strategy, reinvest in Arctic capabilities, not just maritime, but in the civilian space on connectivity, etc. Second area, second framework or second Canadian interest. I talked about NATO building a community of states, capable, agile, interoperative states and militaries that are ready to act. So what do we need to do now? I would say it's in Canada's and every ally's interest to really avoid creating a two-tier alliance. The Russian proposals, those draft treaties they put forward before Christmas, the treaty to the US and the treaty to NATO, I read them and my jaw dropped. But even inside Russia, there was a Russian newspaper at Christmas, after reading the treaties when they were put out publicly, the Russian newspaper said, I see that the president is now asking the alliance to give us unicorns for the new year. So I'm not sure where a solution lies on the current NATO-Russia tensions, but it can't lie in a two-tier alliance where anyone agrees, inside or outside NATO, that there'd be a lesser presence in the East. Rather, as per the point I made a minute ago, we need to bolster in the East. Yeah. So that's now. On the near future, yes, increase European contributions, but two things for us. Go back to why we cared about a structured NATO. A structured NATO would give us a voice and a veto at the table. It would give us a role in shaping decisions. So as the Europeans move to define their strategic compass, and their strategic autonomy should be defined in there, and that will come out before the strategic concept of NATO. That's a lot of strategics. Europe, the risk for us is that we won't be there in the shaping decisions unless two things happen. Unless NATO-EU decision-making is structured in a way that we're not presented with EU fait accompli. And when EU turns to use non-EU third parties in their military activities, that we are able to shape not just original or initial decision-making, but concepts of operations as they unfold. And then there'll be more of an interest for us to participate in those European endeavors. I will finish very quickly, Colin. You gave me 5 minutes and I'm busting the rule, I'm sorry. Third framework, I said, was the rules-based international order. So what do we need to do now? In our interest to maintain the open door. Canada's been one of the top supporters, if not the top supporter of Ukraine since 2014. We should continue that, we should bolster it. But it's very, very important that nobody inside NATO or outside indicate that that door is locked. Ukraine has a long way to go, and that's fine, but do not lock the alliance into a world where the door is can only be opened further by somebody else outside the alliance. Serious mistake, undermining rule of law. 2, NATO decision-making. We've seen a blurring of the lines between peace and war. We need to understand that when Russia, others operate in that gray zone, it makes NATO decision-making much more difficult. In a way, that's the target. We need to bolster our capacity to make NATO decisions quicker, and that requires absolute maintenance of NATO solidarity. But that's now. Future, there's a broader, bigger challenge. 1 second. NATO resilience is the target. It's the target right now, and resilience of our own NATO allied societies is the target. And I would say increasingly conflicts between major powers are occurring in the information space and not as much about seizure of territory. And if that's true, then we have a lot of work to do, not just in improving cyber and our military cyber capabilities, but much broader beyond that to cyber resilience of our major infrastructure, civilian infrastructure, and also beyond that into the information space. Our civilian security literacy, I think, at all levels of government needs to be increased. Do we have the information tools and skills in the government, in the private sector, in our communities to withstand disinformation? So it goes beyond cyber. I would argue it's worth a conversation about information resilience, resilience of our societal structures that would need to be civilian-led. And then military cyber resilience is one part of that conversation. And I will conclude. So Canada's interest in NATO endures, and Canada's interests continue to be served. But ideally, I would love to see the NATO next strategic concept be used as a launch pad to invigorate Canadian domestic debate about our security preparedness, gaps not just in defense, but also our civilian security resilience. And we should use the new strategic concept as a catalyst for even increased Canadian ambition in NATO. Thanks.
Kerry, thank you very much. That's the kind of presentation that should be heard not just by the audience, but also around the cabinet table. And with that, I'm going to turn to David Collenette, who indeed has sat around the cabinet table in various portfolios, including as Minister of National Defence, but today is also representing the NATO Association of Canada, our partner in this webinar, of which David's chair. David, as I say, you've sat around the cabinet, you've seen the debates on NATO. A lot of it comes down to money. We've had Julian and Sandy and Kerry have all said, Canada can and should do more, but that's going to mean more in terms of budgets. So give us a sense of how you would see things from the political perspective, having sat around the cabinet table.
Well, thank you very much, Colin, for the invitation to be here with my esteemed colleagues. And in particular, Kerry has outlined a lot of concerns, priorities from a Canadian perspective, and I'll gloss over some of them because they were also in my remarks from a point of view of time. But I sat around the cabinet table, but I also was an active participant at NATO. Our friends on the webinar today were very much an integral part of the institution in Brussels and understand the intricacies of NATO and how it works. But as a minister attending the NATO defense ministers meetings, I got to work firsthand with my colleagues on some key decisions. And certainly Canada's voice was, I think at the time, and hopefully has been since, very well respected. I remember particularly being involved in the key security decisions around the development of Partnership for Peace, an initiative put forward by Helmut Kohl and his minister, my friend Volker Ruhl, the Minister of Defense at the time, and then really carried forth by William Perry, my counterpart in the Clinton administration. And Canada was an early advocate of Partnership for Peace, for NATO enlargement. And that's quite relevant to today's issues dealing with Ukraine and the admission of members in general. Also, I was very much involved as the Canadian minister, reflecting, discussion at our cabinet, but in particular, the thinking of the Prime Minister on the issue of deploying NATO military, NATO aerial power in the Balkan War. In fact, there were a lot of very tense discussions about using NATO aerial attacks on Bosnian Serb positions. Our Prime Minister, Jean Chrétien, was quite reluctant to see NATO engage in this way, but we were in a sense, we held back a bit because we wanted the alliance to really think through what it was, the precedent that it was going to set. And we were very thorough in our analysis, and then enthusiastically supported that particular engagement of NATO to take part in the bombardment of Bosnian Serb positions, and of course it did lead to the Dayton Accords, which helped to some say end the dispute, but the dispute still rages. But it certainly was a defining moment. I was also involved parenthetically in a security matter in terms of being Minister of Transport on September the 11th, 2001, where Canada's authority over the western half of the North Atlantic under the Chicago Conventions of 1946 gave us the sole authority, gives us the sole authority on air traffic control. And I was able to use my authority under the Aeronautics Act to ensure that about 230 wide-body jets with 35,000 people were landed on Canadian airports within 5 hours. Now, I raised these two examples of ministerial experience from my point of view, and its relevance to Canada at NATO, in the sense that political decision makers need to have a fulsome conceptual framework to make decisions that include detailed policies, well-defined procedures, robust rules of engagement, and resources with leading edge capability. And that is what the strategic document that we are talking about today sets out very well. Political decision makers always use to the best of their ability, always try to ensure to the best of their ability that their actions have widespread support in the body politic. And that's the mandate of the NATO Association of Canada, which, as you know, Colin, is a not-for-profit advocacy group dedicated to the promotion of peace, prosperity, and security through the understanding and importance of NATO. And we work with colleagues in 37 countries under the umbrella of the Atlantic Treaty Association, whose current chair is our friend Jim Townsend, who happens to be one of your colleagues on the Alphen group. There's a narrative among many in NATO countries, and Kerry sort of touched on this, that the alliance is floundering and outdated. In fact, we have done some polling that shows there's an alarming gap between appreciation and recognition and acknowledge of NATO between age groups. Younger people under 35 just do not focus on it. In a sense, the current crisis dealing with Ukraine has had the adverse effect, or the opposite effect to what Vladimir Putin intended. I think it's brought NATO countries together. It's made people realize the importance of NATO. And as far as the NATO Association of Canada is concerned, it has helped us in trying to spread the word about the alliance and its efficacy. But there is a disquiet that we have to deal with in this country, a view that that NATO is out of step with the times, and that Russia is not the same threat that we saw with the Soviet Union during the Cold War, that the political turbulence within many countries within the alliance that have a formidable military strength, which can be deployed to fulfill NATO commitments, is a concern. I won't mention names in particular, but we know those countries. I think that there's also a view that the new isolationism within the United States is diminishing the commitment of NATO's most powerful member, as well as, of course, having other internal repercussions. And of course, as identified in the strategic concept plan, threats and risks now come from non-traditional sources, those utilizing rapidly evolving technologies. And lastly, and Julian mentioned it, the security challenges generally are shifting also to the Asia Pacific region. But all of these threats to the alliance have existed since its creation, and we have to reassure Canadians that this has been the case, but that NATO has always persevered because we are bound by the shared principles of democratic institutions and benefits of collective security. And that's why I believe the Alphen Group's Shadow Strategic Concept 2022 is so important. And again, Julian, congratulations, and to you and your colleagues for drafting what I think is an incredibly comprehensive plan whose breadth and precision of analysis is indeed remarkable. I just want to raise a couple of cautionary points to try to keep within my 5-minute time limit. We have to keep in mind that NATO's strategy will face formidable obstacles on the home front. Kerry touched on it, from a disinterested public, an aversion to increased military budgets as countries confront fiscal challenges from the enormous debt contracted from the pandemic program spending. And I remember my time from 93, 96, when we came into office to confront the financial problems of the country and the massive federal deficit. And we had to cut expenditures in an incredible way, but also balance that by trying to maintain a combat-capable military. I believe that these same pressures are going to affect governments in the next few years, which makes it a challenge to realize some of the goals that so nobly have been set out in the Strategic Council concept document. We also have to, within Canada, and I'm sure in other countries too, counter misinformation from our adversaries. I can't believe the number of really smart friends, responsible people and commentators who bought into the Russian argument that the West committed not to admit the Warsaw Pact nations to join NATO at the dissolution of the Soviet Union. That is absolutely and utterly false. But a lot of people in our country, and I'm sure in other countries in Europe, actually believe this. And it's, as has been pointed out in the document and referred to this morning, the NATO-Russia Founding Act is a comprehensive document of undertaking made by both parties. And of course, they're now in violation of this. The NATO-Russia Council provided a very sound forum to discuss mutual concerns. And, I can remember at least one NATO foreign defense ministers meeting where our two Russian counterparts sat at the same table, working through steps that led to the NATO air attacks on Bosnian Serb positions. We were all colleagues working together. Russia participated willingly, but yet that is a fact that's not appreciated today. And it's part of our job as Canadians, and certainly the NATO Association of Canada, to try to establish those facts so that people are informed of the context to support the ongoing work of NATO. One issue that comes to mind, speaking as a Canadian, but just generally, there is the issue of recalibration of decision-making, command and control, because of the shift in responsibility of NATO's budget, which with the US share falling to 50%. Will the Americans realistically be willing to allow someone other than one of their own be Supreme Allied Commander, given the USA will be the biggest funder and holder of the nuclear arsenal? What do we say to Canadians? Canada's always been squeezed out. We could never be, a military leader could never be the Supreme Commander, but we could also not be the Secretary General or fill the Secretary General's position. I remember having this discussion with Bill Perry in my time. So we're asking Canadians to, in effect, continue our support, and yet symbolically, we seem not to be in the same room when it comes to the allocation of some of the top jobs. There's also the issue, the cultural issues that we see at play right now, dealing with the Ukraine crisis, and what President Macron has advocated, and others, a European military capability. And it begs the question of who's going to be in charge and how will that force relate to NATO command? these are questions I think that Canadians will be asking and will want to know about, and we have to, in selling the strategic concept, have to convince them that we do indeed have a vital stake in the organization going forward. I just want to touch on one point that Kerry mentioned, the Arctic, which is a real conundrum. And it's one I have to tell you that when we worked on the 1994 Defense White Paper, I got incredible pushback from Foreign Affairs, from the defense officials about adding resources to the Arctic. Now, luckily, subsequent governments have somewhat addressed that. Mr. Harper's government paid more attention to that, but there is a real need for us to do more. On the other hand, we are a member of the Arctic Council with Russia, which really, from what I understand, actually works quite well. There's almost been a sort of a separation between the military issues revolving around Russian aggression and NATO, and the environmental and other ecological issues facing the Arctic at a time of global warming. So we have to tread very carefully about the Arctic. I certainly take Kerry's point about NORAD, but that's of course a separate issue. I mean, we must, as Canadians, make sure that the public understands the inordinate expenditure that's required to ensure that Canada is kept free, and it's largely because of the U.S.-Canadian air capability provided through NORAD. I could go on, but I think my time is way up. Thank you, Colin.
David, thanks very much, and my thanks also to the NATO Association that you chair, especially the work you do in trying to raise consciousness amongst younger people around the value of NATO. I know I've been to some of the youth NATO assemblies that have been hosted here, and that's the good work of the NATO Association. Let me now turn to David Perry, because
Thank you.
Again, I encourage people to go to the chat line and put in comments. But David, I know you've been collecting some of the, why don't you pose some of the questions that have come from our audience?
Okay, so I pulled together questions along three different themes. First relates to Europe. Can the people on the panelists on the call talk about how a stronger European pillar of NATO can operate without the United States, what that might look like, and how it would interact with the other various European specific defense initiatives outside of NATO? Second question about engaging in publics. One oriented around how we could engage with the publics in autocratic regimes like Russia, where you have disconnects potentially between the ruling set and the actual population, as well as how we can look at better mobilizing our own public opinion. And then a third and final question about resiliency. So just in the Ukraine crisis alone, there's been at least as much focus in some quarters about energy supplies to Europe as there have been about Mr. Putin's tanks and artillery. We're also seeing here where I'm sitting in Ottawa, a lot of concern about foreign support for anti-government protest movements. So what role is there for NATO to play in the wider aspects of societal resilience that would play into our defense and military security and defense of our populations?
Okay, thanks, David. And I think I'm going to go in the order that people began with those three baskets of questions. Basically, the strategic autonomy question again about Europe and NATO, and then dealing with resiliency and dealing with the whole sort of challenge of broader information. And Julian, why don't you start off?
Thank you, Colin, and thank you to my colleagues for some great interventions. Look, Stoltenberg in November 2019 said that with the departure of Britain from the EU, 80% of all forces committed to European defence are outside the EU. CSDP is tiny. I've just completed a major report for the European Parliament on that, and it clearly has an important role to play. But NATO's the only show in town for the organisation of high-end, credible European force. Now, the way that that's going to have to work, and this relates to burden sharing, because the Americans will not be given a nice, neat single theatre package during a major emergency. They'd be facing threats in Indo-Pacific, possibly the Middle East, Europe, maybe the Arctic. So if Europeans are going to plug the gap and in a sense ensure the US can continue to provide the security guarantee to Europeans alongside Canadians, we are going to have to produce by 2030 something that looks like a multi-domain, high-end, rapid reaction force. And that would be a force that operates across air, sea, land, cyber, space, information, and knowledge, very important strategic enablers, that is from seabed to space. Europeans have the technology. They can certainly, with their North American allies and others, develop that kind of capability. But what's lacking is the will. What's lacking is the ambition. And if all the missions implicit in the NATO 2030 agenda signed off by the heads of state and government is set against the context of NATO credibility, frankly, that's the minimum test. As for the other issues of resilience, resilience is a partnership with the member nations. It's a partnership in Europe with the European Union because it also involves aspect of law and civil defense. NATO can advise in those areas, but ultimately it's the nations themselves that are going to have to make their critical infrastructures, their critical information, their critical people more resilient from the kind of hybrid and cyber attacks which will form part of a new escalation of warfare that is becoming apparent now and will continue to develop over the next decade and beyond. So it's partnership. You cannot project power unless you can protect people. And in the sense, NATO's, I wouldn't call it weakness, Colin, but I would have said a tendency of late is to see NATO as distinct from its citizens and its nations. NATO is the greater sum of its nations. What nations invest in NATO, they'll get a return that's bigger than the sum of all the parts. And I think it's that national political leaders, including in Canada, have to show the leadership to communicate to their citizens as to why NATO not only matters, but is actually a very good value for money way of providing security and defense to all our citizens on both sides of the Atlantic. Colin?
Thanks, Julian. Sandy, let me turn to you on those sort of three questions. So the whole idea of the strategic autonomy versus NATO, dealing with sort of broad information, and then the resiliency, mindful that you come from the country that has bluntly carried the burden since 1949.
Thanks very much. First, I agree with Julian's eloquent answer to these same questions. I would just say, first of all, on European strategic responsibility, first of all, the Europeans have to have the political will to take this responsibility and not just rhetorically talk about strategic autonomy. And that means not only political will, but of course, commitment to provide the resources needed to develop the capabilities. Otherwise, this is going to be an empty shell. But I think if there is more capacity among the European allies to, in some scenarios, take the lead in an operation, these things will have to be worked out through much improved consultations to decide which institution has the best tools to respond, what kind of command arrangements need to be worked out. Should it be through the NATO command structure, which could be done if we revive something like the infamous Berlin Plus framework. It could be done in coalition with willing. CSDP for some smaller operations has shown it does work, even though, as Julian said, large-scale operations will require the robust command structure of NATO. So consultations, flexibility on command arrangements, I think, can make this work in a way that wouldn't mean a parting of the ways, but it'll be a way of having multiple options to deal with different kinds of crises and compensating for the fact that the US will have fewer assets on a daily basis to commit to European scenarios because of the pivot to Asia. On the other questions, engaging our publics, first of all, engaging publics in Russia, countries hostile to the alliance. NATO has barely begun to do that since 2014. They do occasional internet blasts debunking Russian propaganda, but we don't have the same sort of systematic capacity to engage in information warfare. We need to get beyond public diplomacy to information warfare, because this is an integral part of the new way of war that the Russians are waging day in, day out. And we have to explain to our people that Putin is waging a war against the West. And it's not just a question of tanks rolling across borders. At the same time, we need to do more in educating our own publics about why NATO is still worth it. Kerry did a great job in raising the many ways in which NATO is important to Canada and can become more important if some of the ideas she suggested are adopted. Perhaps one silver lining of the current crisis will be to remind people, A, that NATO is still there, that NATO still works, and that we need NATO more than ever in this era of strategic competition with two superpowers. Resilience is a complicated subject. Some groups that are looking at the strategic concept are suggesting that resilience become a fourth core task of the alliance alongside collective defense, crisis management, and cooperative security. We suggest instead that there be a new priority to resilience that would apply to all three of the core tasks. And I would add that I think we would argue that resilience needs to be understood in a comprehensive way. There's the resilience of systems, of critical infrastructure, of cyber networks. There's resilience of our democracies, which may not be NATO's primary responsibility. But I think that unless we have resilient societies that are able to deal with disinformation, hybrid warfare, we're going to have a tough time competing with an aggressive Russia and a revisionist China that mastered these arts of exploiting weaknesses in our resilience. So it's an important issue going forward. Applies to defense, crisis management, and cooperative security across the board.
Thanks, Sandy. Kerry, do you want to take on, I know you've touched on some of these in your response. Do you want to say any response to in terms of dealing with public information, especially in Russia, resilience, as well as the sort of balancing between strategic autonomy and NATO?
Well, I touched on strategic autonomy in NATO, I think, and spoke about some of the structures that need to be put in place so we can shape decisions. There's a Canada-EU security dialogue that has been underway, security and defense dialogue, for a number of years. In fact, the new US bilateral dialogue with the EU is based on ours. So there's a platform for us to contribute more via Canada-EU bilateral and also through NATO. We just have to make sure we do smart diplomacy and align them. I'm going to focus on resiliency in the info space. And Sandy mentioned info warfare. And yes, Russia is engaging in information warfare, absolutely. Others are doing that as well, starting to, some are farther along. But we need to be focusing on the information continuum. So there's information warfare, there's stratcoms, there's public diplomacy, and there's public education. There are a number of tools in the civilian and military space that we need to think through in a more structured, strategic way. So what's NATO's role? I'll give you an example in Latvia. We actually engage in defensive info ops there. How do we do that? Pre-deployment, our troops are trained on info hygiene to understand what their use of social media, the risks there, and to understand the risks to some of our infrastructure. Second, we've put in place steps to understand messaging, both content and source. So on content, there were three kinds of messages that the Russians were launching around our Latvia EFP. One was seeking to exacerbate divisions with Russian-speaking minorities in Latvia, which is huge. Two was to attack the Canadian Armed Forces' integrity and the reasons for being there. And that showed up in a couple of different ways. There's allegations of sexual assault, so using women, peace, and security against us. Yeah. And there's allegations of, all sorts of allegations about imperialism. So that's the content of the message. So we trained people to understand what the content was they had to look out for, and then put in place things so we could trace where those messages came from, and then work with local authorities to determine who's best placed to counter those messages. So that's a very small example of how NATO can engage in that endeavor, but it's only part of a larger job that is about information resilience. So cyber resilience is a subset of that, and military cyber resilience is a subset of that. And unless you have the civilian part of that equation engaged and understand where our vulnerabilities are, for instance, our infrastructure in Canada, our banking infrastructure, et cetera, unless you have the civilian part of that engaged, you won't be able to be completely resilient. So I think it's worth some conversation about at least defensive cyber. I won't mention the words, I'm going to mention offensive cyber. We need to have the conversation about it.
We do.
But we need to plug it into a little bit more work inside Canada on security resilience, security awareness, and information resilience.
All right, thanks, Kerry. David, you touched on some of these themes. David Collenette, do you want to add anything more? Just click off. I think you're on mute.
Sorry, it's pretty tough when you're number 4 in the banking paper with such eminent people to add more. Julian, I believe, talked about NATO being regarded as a sort of a foreign organization that's not relevant to member states, to the body politic. And I think that's our biggest challenge, even in Canada. NATO is over there. It's not us, and we have to try through our education to ensure that people understand that we are part of NATO. We're part of its decision making, and that it does reflect us as a people, and it is there to look after us, and not just in terms of military warfare in the conventional sense, but as Kerry talked about, in terms of the threats to Canadian daily life through cyber attacks, and we've seen some of this a little bit in Canada, but also in other countries. So that's part, I think, a focus of our organization, that we have to really try to educate people, not just about the alliance and historical perspective and the physical aggression that we're seeing on the TV screens on a nightly basis with the assembly of Russian forces, but how almost there's a quiet subversion of basic systems that affect our life. I
think that makes a lot of sense, David. I think that you underline we've got a lot of work to do at home, and sort of I'm now going to lead with you on my final question, which is a fairly simple one. What are you reading or streaming these days?
Well, you mean as an organization?
No, yourself.
Sorry, I don't.
One of the things our audience often likes to know is are you individually reading or streaming?
Oh, I'm sorry. Well, if you're talking about my reading habits,
yes,
being an old timer, I'm one book I've just finished is the Daughters of Yalta, which is an incredible account of the events at Yalta from the perspective of Churchill's daughter, Roosevelt's daughter, and Averell Harriman's daughter, and the pressures that the leaders were under, and how decisions that were taken at Yalta have really caused the beginning, caused the Cold War, and how if you read it very thoroughly, you think that perhaps what is happening today in defense of NATO expansion really is to maintain the world that should have been in 1945, that took 45 years of Cold War to actually achieve. So I just throw out that one book, but I tend to be someone that gets involved in a lot of history around the war period.
Oh, that's a great suggestion. All right, Kerry, what are you reading or streaming these days?
Well, I'll give you two answers. One, I'm reading my husband's draft book on the correspondence, the letters between his father and Lester B. Pearson throughout their lives. So watch that space. And I am watching the Will Ferrell oeuvre of films to deepen my knowledge of, yeah.
All right. Well, I very much look forward to Michael's book. Having Jeffrey Pearson was my first, as we call him then, assistant undersecretary, and took great care. And I enjoyed my first posting thanks to his intervention. All right, Sandy, what are you reading or streaming these days?
Okay, well, my wife has just got a copy of The Daughters of Yalta. It sounds like I should steal it from her. But I'm reading a book called The Ministry of the Future. It's about sort of a near future apocalyptic story about the effects of climate change leading to mass migration and other calamities, but also leading to the pursuit of technologies which may mitigate it. But I'm just getting into it. I don't know whether it ends hopefully or gloomily.
My wife read it, and I think there's a follow through. So I'm not sure how it ends because I haven't read it yet, but she certainly recommended it as well. Julian, what are you reading or streaming these days?
Well, I'm working on a new book at the moment on allied capability and capacity in the past and burden sharing. And I'm reading The British Pacific Fleet, the Royal Navy's most powerful strike force by David Hobbs. Now, the British Pacific Fleet, Task Force 57, is often forgotten in 1944 and 45, but it was 297 ships strong, of which there were 5 Royal Canadian Navy ships, which were also present and served very nobly during that period in support of the Americans, in support of Nimitz in the Pacific. And there was a wonderful quote, which I'll briefly give to you, from a US Navy liaison officer on HMS Indefatigable, which was one of our 9 armored fleet carriers. We had armored aircraft carriers, the Americans didn't. And he said, when a kamikaze hits a US carrier, it's 6 months repair at Pearl. In a Limey carrier, it's a case of sweepers, man your brooms. And of course, the famous case of HMS Victorious was hit by a kamikaze, full on, and 35 minutes later, the captain hoisted, operations resumed, because all it did was dent the deck. And that to me is burden sharing in action.
All right, Julian. Well, I'm reading The Lost Pianos of Siberia, which I heartily recommend. It's beautifully written, and it's an evocative, almost travelogue of Russia of an earlier time, as well as contemporary, which is well worth reading. A reminder of another Russia, not the one necessarily we read about in the papers. Well, thanks for joining us today in this special CGAI webinar on the NATO strategic concept. And again, the paper can be found on the CGAI website. We were joined today by Julian Lindley-French, Sandy Vershbow, Kerry Buck, and the Honorable David Collenette. Thanks to our producer, Charlotte Duval-Antoine, and to Drew Phillips. I'm Colin Robertson, and thank you again for joining us today.
Thank you, Colin. Thank you all.
Thank you all.
Thank you.